Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs.
One for the next bit another time. That's fine.
All right, well, here's the deal. We're already recording, okay? And see, you, before I started recording, you probably justifiably accused me of being long-winded. And
I don't mind when we ramble and go long. It's the fact that you say that we'll keep it short. I just accept that won't happen. So that's
it's going to happen today.
Doesn't bother me.
It's going to happen today. So we're going to talk about, before we get into this, we are going to talk about character creation, different modes of character creation. And
skipped our normal intro.
I know that, but I just wanted to make sure that people were clear as we ramble on about things that we have not defined. People at least know, what are we rambling on about right now? We're rambling on about this idea of character creation, which we're not going to be long-winded about. We're going to get to the point. But before we get started, so we can get to the point, how are you on this fine day?
Good. How are you? You haven't done any gaming at the weekend. You said you
I haven't done any gaming in weeks. We did not do any gaming this last weekend because
you were on holiday.
Every person was taken up by something else.
Yeah, you were on holiday for a week and a half, though. So, sorry, vacation because you're American.
Right. Or if you want to be cutesy sounding, you call it vacay.
Oh God, no! Don't say that.
I know. Don't do that.
No. So I did do some gaming. In fact, I did quite a bit of gaming at the weekend. Because I went to a Shatterpoint tournament on Sunday, but we'll ignore that bit. Thursday for what would be our weekly meetup. Couldn't meet at ours because we had friends that were coming over with a small child. I was like, right, well, I'll skip the guys having to put up with that. So I'll go to Brian's instead. And I was like, right, I'm going to Brian's. I'm not taking a bunch of role-playing stuff with me. What can we do? They were both very unhelpful. I don't know, whatever you want. It's like, oh, for God's sake. It's like, not only am I the DM and have to do all the prep, I also have to decide what we're going to do. To be fair, this because they don't
care.
Players
are the worst, aren't they?
They are.
You know what? These role-playing game things would be so much easier if they wouldn't work without players. Never mind.
Well, unfortunately, they wouldn't work. The little pawns that you can make dance my puppets. Unfortunately. Anyway, so I didn't do role-playing. So we started playing this board game, which I'd kickstarted. This huge box. Which, when it had turned up, I'd gone, oh, that's a very big box. I'm not even looking at that. And it said it was like 4 hours playtime. And I was like, I'm sure this game wasn't that long. Called ISS Vanguard. Anyway, so it's a space thing where I think it's like your humanity's first people out into space. And it was an awful lot. We spent about an hour just setting up the box correctly. And then an hour setting up the game to play it for about an hour. But actually, you can see it's going to be a really good game in that kind of the actual game bit is quite straightforward, but then in between that, kind of like a Kingmaker thing, there's, not kingdom management, but there's ship management, and you recruit new members of your crew, and you promote people, and you do research.
Cool.
It sounds like it's really what a big single player computer game should be, and it would be a lot quicker, but it's done on a board thing. So yeah, there's some quite cool bits to it. So I'm really excited to be carrying on. But it's a long old thing, so it's going to take us a very, very long time.
Cool.
But I was kind of like, this sounds really exciting. I'm like looking forward to hiring new crew members and going to things. And it's like there's a book with loads of log entries, like a choose your own adventure type thing. But there's an app that does it instead, and it's all voiced and it has music. So yeah, I was really enjoying that. So I'm looking forward to kind of actually. Playing it almost we basically played the tutorial, but it was like the first mission.
Yeah.
So now we get to go off onto more missions on our big ship.
I think it'd be really cool is if you had a like a flat screen, like a table that you could use with multiple different board games and war games. It'd basically be a VTT but would be meant to be used by people who are with one another, not.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something tactile to pieces and parts, but I remember the nightmare of old school Axis and Allies. The original version is a long time to set up and then forever to play. And so anyway, whatever.
No, that's definitely there is.
It doesn't necessarily exist in the way I wanted to, and stuff I'm not going to spend money on.
But there is definitely a lot of really good board games have ridiculous setup and takedown times. So playing on online things when you can just press a button, and it's set up.
Yeah,
it's cool. But
so you played that, no role playing.
I played that.
And
No.
I did nothing. It's not that I did nothing. I wrote. I worked on game stuff, but I did know.
Eris game stuff or new game stuff?
Mostly new, and then another writing project that I've been working on. That's something different, and then a little bit of Eris.
Look at you, Mr. Writing.
I know. So let's get serious and talk about character creation here.
Yes, because I almost went off on another tangent then from what you said.
See,
I'll
you
leave it.
You say I go off on tangents.
I don't say I don't. I just doesn't bother me. I don't say we're going to be short.
So character creation, for the purpose of getting to character creation ideas for our respective game ideas, I don't think it's, I mean, there's so many different ways to create characters. I don't think it's necessary to go into like obviously not all of them.
No,
or even
I don't
go
mean
into
to go
like lots of examples, but
I think we kind of said last week that you can kind of break it down into sort of 4 key areas, and then there's some sort of parts of that to highlight. So I'm going to mention what these 4 key areas are, then we can think of some examples of these. So on one end, you've got the sort of, literally there is no character creation. You get what you'd kind of see in a starter set. Here is your character. And then there's games that maybe are then kind of go into things where the character creation is very structured. You talk about it as a menu. So that would be, say, the next one. The life pathy kind of that goes beyond just a simple menu thing into it's a lot more complex because, you know, like it's got more stuff. And then at the far end, point by. That's how I characterize the whole thing. And then we just pick some that to go through between those things.
Yeah, I see it a little differently, that like on a, not necessarily a continuum, because I mean, it's very outside of character, rather outside of like starter sets where you show up at a convention and you're just given a character. Something had to create that character in the first place. It didn't just sprout from nothing. There was a set of rules that gave birth to it, whether you're the one who did it, a GM or a designer somewhere. So the way I look at it is you've got
not entirely true.
Oh, huh?
So if you play a superhero game, those characters have been pre-created for you. And I can think of at least one system, very famously, where there were not clear and concrete rules for how to come up with those characters, which would be Marvel Heroic Role-Playing, where the main thing was that literally that had the 2 extremes. On the one end, it's like, make the hell what you want, with no point by just...
Yeah, it's a good point.
Make what you want. But on the other hand, you know, most superhero games, people do want to play. Now, you're absolutely right. There are rules for most games have rules for how to come up with the superheroes on those character sheets. But Marvel Heroic is actually one example of one that said, we expect you to play with our heroes. If you want to make up your own, here's some vague rules to do it.
Yeah. See, then to be, maybe this is at the risk of being nitpicky, I wouldn't count those. I'm talking about you create a character to some degree, whether you take something and you finalize it, or you tweak it, or you throw some switches figuratively to make it your own, or you start from nothing. My point is that I see it as, you know, you go back in time and, you know, D&D started off with pick a race or roll some stats. It didn't make a difference which one you started with. You know, typically you start with, you know, you roll your attributes, you pick a race, you see which class you qualify for, and then you buy some equipment, and that's it. Oh, and you might choose a spell or two if that's relevant to you.
I mean, D&D hasn't really moved a huge amount beyond that.
No, it hasn't.
Now, I mean, you know, on top of that, maybe at level 1 you have to pick something for your class.
Right.
You probably have way more spells. And you now have backgrounds, right? And you might have to pick your skills, but
it doesn't.
On the whole, it's still quick,
right? And it does, like with a background. A background is not a step. To me, it's like if there are steps, that implies a sequence. Like a life path has steps.
Yes.
Right, because one leads to the next, and they build on one another. I mean, aside from your background, maybe informing which skills you choose from your class, it doesn't matter whether you choose background first or class first. They're just...
No, that's why I think, like you said, like a menu is a good way. Yeah. You didn't say it today, you said it previously. A menu is a good way of thinking of that.
Yeah.
Of course, the menu does imply that you do it in order. I mean,
Not
usually in order.
You can start with dessert. Hey, I
Yeah,
spent a week on a cruise ship. I could start with, I could pick my dessert first and then work backward to my appetizer, and then I place my order for all three.
I
But
think
yeah,
a
my
menu's a good analogy.
yeah, I think menu versus sequence, and a sequence has
Yeah,
steps, and a menu just has items. So plenty of games just have menus, and I think that D&D nowadays is at each level is more that than anything else. Pathfinder is really the same, but it has more. There are more things to
there's more
choose.
choices on each thing. Yeah.
Um, Conan 2D20, Infinity, Star Trek Adventures. Those are more life paths.
Well,
They're not super rigid.
let's before we
Oh,
jump
okay.
onto that, if we're talking about menus, what? Because actually, there's another one I want to go back to the character creation thing. While we're talking about menus, what do you think is good and bad about a menu thing? Because I think this is useful to be able to then
I think a
do on
menu
this.
provides flexibility. Like you are
I was gonna say,
what?
to me, one of the things I have an issue with is that it's the opposite. It provides this sort of rigid structure that you have to fit with. Well, that's not entirely true. It depends on how you've created it.
Sure.
But so, like in D&D, your class is you pick your you can't change race. You pick
Right.
your class. That class then ties you into a whole bunch of stuff forever. Pathfinder's better in that respect because you don't, you can be a bit more free opening with it. So actually, it's not fair to blame the idea of the menu. It's the how it works within the menu. But
Yeah.
one of the things that bugs me about 5e, and actually even earlier ones, like the ones you said, the original version where you would pick your race was your class, like basic D&D,
Sure.
where like
For
dwarf
demi-humans, it
and
was.
elf. And then you don't have any choices. Once you've picked that, you've rolled your stats, you've picked your class, you buy some equipment, and then you are locked in pretty much to that.
I mean, unless like if you were an elf and you had some spells, but that was the exception. The reason why I called a menu approach flexible is because okay, here's my analogy. Every meal, breakfast, well, not breakfast, lunch and dinner, if I went to the main dining room on the ship, I got a
Yep.
menu that had appetizer, main, dessert. It had a list for each of those three, and those lists changed each day. But
Yep.
it didn't matter which one if I was drawn to something on the main dish first, and then I was like, oh yeah, I got to figure out my appetizer if I want one. It didn't matter. The fact is, when I placed my order, I ordered those three things regardless of what order I settled on them in. And so that's where a menu, because it's also, I see figuratively as everything is in front of you at once. There are no
Yeah,
gates.
that's what I think is the good bit of it,
And
being
so,
able to
so if you,
see clearly.
yeah, I think if you have a reasonably clear idea or some kind of idea about what kind of character you want to play, this is what my character wants to be at the jumping off point to high adventure. A menu can be really easy because then you can say, okay, how will I arrange these different pieces and choose these different pieces to make that thing that I want my character to be upon beginning a story. So there's an advantage there.
See that's when I think a menu. Where I think a menu is really good is when you're not really right. We're all going to play D&D. All right, cool. Everybody sits down. Do you know what well, I don't really know what I want to play. Right. Well, here's your options. Just like a menu, I'm going to pick. I like the idea of this race and this class and this other thing. And then now you have a character because you don't have an idea. What I find, and this, like I said, why I find it a bit more rigid and it's too structured, is that when you actually turn, I want to play this. I've seen this film, I've read this book, I've got this really cool idea from some anime I watched. I want to play this character that can do this, this, and this. And then in something like D&D, because of the menu, you're like, well, it kind of sounds like this, but yeah, this thing doesn't really
I don't
exist,
think
and yeah, the
that's
class doesn't, and
I don't think that's
that's why I don't
inherent
like it.
to a menu approach. I think
No, you can have that problem in
that's
any
based on
system.
the
Yeah,
game. I do
yeah,
see your point though, that if you approach this and like heck, I mean, you sit down for lunch or dinner and you're like, I have no idea. I wasn't thinking, oh gee, I'd really love to have pasta. If you walk up and then pasta's not available, you're sad. But but you might not have any idea. And then when you look at the options, something jumps out at you. That's a good point. So I think it depends on the system. Anything else about menus?
no, not by menus. I wanted to jump back to the thing that's even more restrictive than a menu, which you said wasn't character creation, but and it isn't quite. Going past the one where the characters are completely created for you, there are a handful of systems, and we saw this more back in the day. We don't see it as much anymore, where like the characters like a really strict archetype. So I don't mean archetype in the sense that we talk about it in like 2D20. I'm thinking of something like Star Wars, where like you played the smuggler,
right,
or the pilot.
right.
And I also see that in things like Torg. And nowadays you actually do still see it in things like Powered by the Apocalypse. Any Powered by the Apocalypse game, like literally you have your class. Yeah, I know. But so you have the class sheet. So you get to, you might have a couple of options within
You
that.
get to obey.
It's not even as close as the menu thing. You are fully locked into this whole thing, and you might put a couple of points here and there and tweak it to what you want and pick an ability. So it's even like a more restrictive version of menu. Straight up, I'm just going to say I'm not a fan of those. And if I was doing a system, I would not be doing, not to that extent anyway, because you really are on a thing that, right, I've got a really good idea of the character I want to play. And then you look at the things provided and none of them match. Star Wars worked out fine. If you wanted to play the Jedi, if you wanted to play, Han or Leia or Lando or Luke or even Chewie, there was probably a thing for you. Also, it had like, the core book's about like 30 archetypes. Well, we see like, Powered by the Apocalypse, it's like 8.
Yeah, well, I don't want to talk about that game because it's terrible.
Not enough. So I don't like that. If you're going to do that, you need loads of options.
Yeah, and here's the thing about that, and I wouldn't call that like West End's Star Wars was the first time I had seen something like that, where you have these templates.
Yeah,
you choose exactly a template, and then you make a few final choices. I wouldn't call that character creation. Call that character finalization.
Yeah,
or character customization. That's it. That works well if you have, I think, a clearly defined setting for whatever reason, and there's a lot of variety. I agree. I don't have a problem with those, but you got to know what you're getting into. And I'm not going to talk about that other one. So, okay. So now we can move forward. We can move away from menus to what?
Well, you call them sequences because you're right. It's not always a life path.
We can call it a sequence, or I mean, life path, I think, is the most common example of a sequence. That there is a layered effect. There you build your character in steps, phases, or by layers. And oftentimes life paths are like this. Like Cyberpunk 2020 was the first life path that I remember, where you start off and you roll through family and relationships and all this, so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that Cyberpunk 2020 was actually a menu for the mechanical side of your character. For the fluffy side of your character, it was a life path. It actually didn't really combine those two things. I think modern life path systems, like I would say that Star Trek Adventures is one. Conan 2D20 and Infinity, I think, definitely are. Achtung Cthulhu, a little bit less so. It's a sequence, but less of a life path.
It's close to a menu.
Star Trek, you start off with your species, and then you move to your home world, or then your family, and it's like you build chronologically through this sequence, and you add these layers, which then they don't happen. When I say independently of one another, and I think this is one of the advantages, but it can also be, depending on how well it's done, how well it's executed, and a person's preferences, it could be restricting, is that each decision affects what is possible for what is next, or can shape what comes next. Like Conan, definitely, you move through that, and each step affected what options you would have at the next step. You'd have to put some thought into it. Achtung Cthulhu, I think, a little bit less so. Achtung Cthulhu is it's a sequence. It's almost like a sequence of menu items, whereas Star Trek Adventures is closer to a life path. I think sequence systems are good when maybe you don't have a really clear idea, or you want to think through it, and so you have some guidance. I think also if you do have a decent idea, it can be interesting from a story standpoint as you build, quote unquote, your character, and you start to envision this character growing up. And oh, why did my, like in, in Traveler, like why did my character, which I'd say is a life path system,
Definitely.
why did you choose to go into the Marines and do 2 terms and then like you left the Marines and you became a merchant? Well, what is that? Did you put down your weapons and become like, I just want to travel the stars and sell stuff? Or are you security on a ship or whatever? You start to think story wise. I think life paths can be really good um, in doing that.
I really like the ones where, because to me, Star Trek is when they started moving away. That it still has some of the elements of that, but then after Star Trek, I don't even think they're life paths anymore, because the thing that you had in Mutant Chronicles and Infinity and Conan was actually like things that happened to your character in childhood, and then when you were getting your education, and then when you were, you had the war stories in Conan. So by the time you actually got to your character being finished, you had a story, you had not a background in the D&D sense of it. It's a word, and everyone who picks that as the same. You had a bunch of different events that had happened to your character that took them to the starting point they were at, which was really good.
Yeah, and that really helps you build the background.
Yeah.
Like the game and the designers are helping you build a character with a backstory that makes sense for the world and your character.
I mean, obviously, that's a lot of work to put into a system. That's from a GM, not GM, a GM, from a developer's point of view, it's a ball. It's very, very difficult. And the only other downside from a player point of view is if you've got a really defined idea and the life path doesn't let you choose. But most good life paths nowadays will be, look, if you don't know, roll, but if there's a particular thing you want, you pick the thing you want. Or, you'd have the weird things on 2D20 where you'd have so many points and you could spend a point on a particular table to roll, and it just a bit, it's easy to just go, look, either if you want something, you pick it on the table, and otherwise you just roll, and that would be fine. I love the idea of life paths because I like the idea of you created a character and you didn't just put a bunch of stuff on a piece of paper. There was a story. Like your character now has an actual story at the point you start playing.
You know what too is that if whether you do character creation as a party of players, that is, or individually, if you're all working through the same life path sequence, you end up having characters that do have something of a backstory each, but there's a degree of coherence between them instead of the dreaded, the 5e menu built character, and then the player writes like the 12-page tortured backstory, and no one's interested in it, but they still want to. I think I think a life path helps make for a common character creation experience, which then you can suss out that story. You're right. Obviously, a drawback to it is if you have some idea for your character and it's just like, how does this fit? Now, I mean, obviously that could be because maybe you have, I'll just come out and say odd or story unrealistic visions for your character that, oh yeah, I want to play Star Trek Adventures, but my character is actually a Jedi from another dimension. And you're just like, dude, go back to middle school. Come on now. You have a pet dinosaur while you're at it. So yeah, it can be limiting. So, okay. So we've got a menu, we got a life path, and a sequence is something akin to that. It's a type of.
I mean, I think the far extreme of the other one is just having a huge bunch of choices. The far extreme is the crazy ass kind of point by where, everything has a different point value and you put it together. Now, some other games aren't that extreme. Something like, let's say, Genesis or Savage Worlds is literally a kind of a skill point-based thing, which is much more straightforward, right? You get this many points to spend on attributes, you get this many points to spend on your skills, and you get this many points to spend on your abilities. And they're clearly defined. And it's not so much a menu because you're not picking a clear, there's not a clear class there, but there's not really a sequence. It's like you have it, your character, essentially, one way your character is made up of this, this, and this. And for each of those, here's how you do it. And, World of Darkness is classic like that.
That's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah, you have so many points to spend on your attributes. You have so many points to spend on skills, your merits, your fancy abilities. At some point, you do pick a kind of it's almost like a race, but it's not a race because you're all the same race. But the different kind of
if you're playing
clan,
vampire, you're going to pick a clan. If you're playing werewolf, you're going to pick like whatever fuzzy dog pack you're part of, or something like that.
Yeah.
But right, it actually. Go ahead.
Go on. No, I was going to say you go ahead.
I was just thinking of this with because I was thinking about this a bit ago, and you just made me think of it right now. I mean, Vampire the Masquerade, it actually doesn't matter. If you look at, your character and you're like, you just have this vision, I want my character to be rich. So you spend points, like the first thing you do is you dump a couple of points into resources under backgrounds. And that actually doesn't matter. There's some guidance. Now, there's a difference. I think, I would call World of Darkness like a point buy system, but it's point buy in bins.
Yes.
Because different things cost, you have different amounts of points to spend on different things.
Yeah.
And you aren't like, how Vampire the Masquerade will give you, you have 9 attributes in 3 bins of 3, and you have certain amount of points to spend in each of those. So like a pure point buy is like, here are your points, do what you want with them.
Yeah.
And maybe there are different like attributes cost this much and skills cost that much, but you still there are no limitations for how much you can spend in each category, whereas there's a little bit of guidance there. And by the way, some oddity, I just got a pop-up that says that this free meeting ends in 10 minutes. That must be some upgrade from Zoom that now only gives you 40 minutes of free, which is my university account. So we have to rush.
Okay. Well, we'll be finished in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Then you'll have to start another call so we can finish our off-call conversation. It might be limited to that much a day.
This will limit us in the future.
I actually really like the World of Darkness. When I first saw that, I was like, I love this. You've got a huge amount of options, and I think part of the thing I liked is it gave points to things. When you start leveling, that's very simple because then you get XP and you spend the XP on the different things because, like you said, everything has different points cost. Yep. You do get that flexibility at the end. I don't have enough points to spend for attributes. Fine, we'll use the extra points at the end to spend on the thing that you didn't get enough for. But the way you created your characters was super straightforward. If you needed to knock up a character quickly, you could. If you wanted to spend ages, you could do that as well. But partly it's also what you put into it, because I've created good characters in like World of Darkness stuff because of the merit stuff. So by coming up with the different merits, that gives you an idea of what your character's like and how they fit into the world. Now, that's the kind of thing, that's the bit I like about that. And I did that when I've come up with other role playing games of my own. I'm going to take that merits bit out of World of Darkness, which I like, which is the different thing, and I'm going to put it in another system. Mm-hmm. It's the kind of thing you don't get in other systems. Like some systems have, flaws and like advantages and flaws, which are, personality kind of things, or like your character starts with a nemesis. Like Savage Worlds and some other systems I've seen do that kind of thing, cool, which lots of other systems, again, don't. Kind of story things, but you start with those story things, or you deliberately start with some of those things. Now, that can work in any of the things we've talked about so far. But in something like World of Darkness or a full point buy, it'd be, a way of getting extra points. But it's, again, I like the things where your character is more than just a bunch of numbers. It actually has some narrative thing into it. You can do this into any of these.
I like also with one of the things about World of Darkness that it's a point buy in categories.
Yeah.
But that it's menu-like in that everything is available to you all at once. Unlike a life path where sometimes if you want to make changes, you have to undo things.
Yeah.
You have to go away. You get to go back and strip away layers if you're following depending on how rigid the rules are, how detailed they are. So yeah, I've always thought still that World of Darkness's creation system was really good and clean. And now it doesn't readily give you this, like, put front and center in your face this idea of, oh, you were born here and you grew up here, and it doesn't do that. But I think there's enough in it that it gives you ideas. And of course, that those game books, they didn't even get into the core rules until like almost 200 pages into the flipping book, because all of it was just soaked in this, dramatic, language and discussion of the world. So by the time you got to character creation, you had a really clear idea of the vibe of things. So I like that. And then obviously the next step I think is just pure point buy. Like there are no categories, there are no bins. It's just you just have a giant heap of points based on, based on maybe the campaign power level or something like that, like Mutants and Masterminds.
Yeah. Mutant Mastermind, I think the trouble with any full point buy thing is there's always going to be something where the points value is probably wrong. Right. And then you work out, if I put my points into this, my character ends up being completely over the top.
Things get all wanged up.
I mean, I don't think I've ever seen, Mutant Mastermind by, third edition now. It's maybe not as bad, but there's still always going to be somewhere where something is overcosted or undercosted. And so it's going to feel bad, or your character ends up being just garbage, or it ends up being too good. And also it's just super, like making those characters super complicated. Yeah. That's why I like World of Darkness approach.
Yeah. Having bins or categories, which is what I would say, either or. I think categories sounds better. It gives you enough guidance that you're not just like, I'm wandering around. Like I have a hammer and a handful of nails, and I have no idea what to do with them. Like,
so
some
Shadowrun. Shadowrun. The game itself hasn't been really common. Character creation is lengthy, but they do a clever thing where right at the start you go, right, you have like this A, B, C, D, E, right? I'm going to have my best thing is going to be my skills. Then it's going to be like my abilities. Then it's going to be resources. And then the last one will be like my race, right? Well, I put the lowest thing as my race. I have to be a human because they're the most basic. But I get this many points because I put my A as skills. I'm going to have loads of skills. This is what I put into attributes. My attributes would be this. I've got a medium amount. So it's, it kind of feels you rather than, because otherwise Shadowrun would be horrible because you've got so many different things you can make a character for. That's quite a clever way of, again, kind of like World of Darkness does, except there you have to pick your priorities. And again, it's like bins of points. Yeah. It's not just here, have everything. It's just right. Because of your choice, you've got this for this, this for this, this for this. And it focuses the mind. It makes it a bit easier. I think that's where I do quite like that kind of.
Yeah, me too.
I think that's the sweet spot.
So because we're not going to go into it, we'll go into it in the next episode. That is what we're thinking of character creation for our own games. It sounds to me like that is what you're leaning toward. Is that correct?
I would have thought so. I mean, essentially, the part of the reason is I actually think it's the least intensive thing for a developer to have to do. Yeah, life path, a detailed,
like setting-focused life path could be a nightmare. I don't want to.
And it's the same thing. Like having to create a bunch of templates or classes for your menu system means you've got to create a bunch of stuff which no one might ever use. And you might not play test it. Realistically, you have to play test all that stuff. Yeah. So if instead you're going to I'm going to have, skills and whatever you're going to have, then I think that makes it a little bit easier in terms of what you can actually, from the kind of where we're coming from, that's probably a little bit less work.
Yeah, and
it's also not the insanity of point buy.
Outside of generic, flexible, like somewhat guidance providing character archetypes, I can't go that detailed in background and setting because the idea of this horror game is that you could play during the American Revolution, or you could play in the 1950s. Like I can't get that detailed. So I'm going to really focus on just kind of generic, like archetypal character types with lots of customization options. So mine is going to look more like a World of Darkness kind of thing with a little bit of guidance for like very generic character type. But we can get into that. We can get into that in our next episode.
So don't forget to do the usual stuff.
What's the usual stuff you're supposed to do?
Like, subscribe, join the conversation in the comments or on the Discord.
Ring the bell.
Don't forget to send us money to our secret bank account.
That's right.
Join the cabal.
Unmarked, unsequential bills in a greasy paper sack to our P.O. Box dead drop.
Yeah, so secret that we don't even know it.
Well, then we could tell people if we were interrogated. Duh. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.